Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. In 2001, I had the honor of meeting Professor Gerda Lerner in person at the University of Wisconsin-Madison during my term there as a George L. Mossy doctoral fellow. So it is very moving for me to be here today, 25 years later, as part of this international symposium dedicated to her life and legacy. I would like to thank Vera very much for inviting me to talk about Gerda Lerner and the gendering of global slavery studies in light of my ongoing research on female slavery in the early modern Mediterranean, together with Einav Ovadia, a doctoral fellow in this ERC project. As a civil rights activist and a feminist scholar of American history, the links connecting the phenomenon of slavery with the oppression of women, as well as the interplay of abolitionist thought and feminist consciousness in the 19th century, interested Lerner throughout her academic career. Like other historians of slavery living and working in the US, the type of slavery that initially caught her attention was the enslavement of Blacks in North America and its enduring legacy of racism. The subject of Lerner's dissertation, which was published in 1967, and we already heard about it yesterday and today, was the abolitionist Grimke sisters. How do I move the slides?
Just to click here.
Okay. So,
yeah.
So I hope you can see the slide also, those who connected remotely. So the abolitionist Grimke sisters, white women who were born into a slaveholding family and became critical of the system of slavery, and also advocated for women's rights in the 1830s. Importantly, whereas the Grimke sisters embraced the woman-slave analogy as a rhetorical tool, Lerner herself cautioned against modern feminists' misuse of the so-called slave comparison in their own writings. In her 1979 book, The Majority Finds Its Past, Lerner warned against a feminist perpetuation of the woman as slave worldview, which could lead to positioning women qua women primarily as victims of oppression, while eliding their significant contributions to various aspects of the human past. Moreover, she argued that equating the oppression of women with that of enslaved women elided the real plight of the slave, and these are her words. The Grimke sisters, in other words, were certainly far less victimized than the Black women who were enslaved by their family members. Lerner further elaborated her argument regarding the impossibility of sisterhood between enslaved women and female slavers or members of slaveholding families in the creation of patriarchy, which came out in 1987 and which we already heard quite a lot about yesterday and today. Her analysis of the workings of patriarchy in this book, however, also elucidated the reasons that women's contributions to the abolitionist cause have long been undervalued or disregarded. Lerner's arguments in this regard continue to influence the historiography of anti-slavery activities and their links to the promotion of women's rights, not only in the United States, but also in the Spanish Caribbean and in the French colonies in the Atlantic world. And these are just a few examples of relatively recent studies that were influenced by her writings in this context. In her 1972 book, Black Women in White America, whose very publication was, as Linda Gordon observes, a political act, Lerner made it a point to include documents chronicling the lives of enslaved women themselves, so shifting from the abolitionists to the enslaved women. This early work influenced the formation of leading historians of American slavery. Lerner's early archivally based studies of enslaved women in the 19th century American South eventually also led to her broader interest in female slavery as a historical phenomenon that transcended and transcends geographical and chronological boundaries. In 1983, she undertook a courageous excavation of deep time to understand the origins of slavery. Her article on women and slavery was published in the journal Slavery and Abolition, the most important journal in the field of slavery studies even today, and also formed part of the creation of patriarchy in chapter 4 titled The Woman Slave. So a slightly different title, but it's essentially the same essay. The first study to focus specifically on the enslavement of women and examine it from a comparative perspective, this pioneering essay explored the cultural invention of slavery in ancient societies. Lerner famously argued that the oppression of women antedates slavery and makes it possible. The idea that some categories of human beings could be subjugated to others, that is, enslaved, is, she observed, a human invention. It only became possible because an idea of permanent subordination had already developed in ancient Mesopotamia, where Lerner proposed patriarchy first came into being. Men, she suggested, must have noticed that women deprived of the protection of their kinsmen soon became socially marginal, thereby learning how differences could be used to separate and divide one group of humans from others. Slavery was thus developed as the means for making such separation into a permanent condition. According to Lerner, women's enslavement in ancient times provided the model for enslaving men in forms that were to profoundly shape New World slavery in early modern and modern times. Lerner took issue with sociologist Orlando Patterson's famous Slavery and Social Death, a comparative study, which came out just a year earlier in 1982. And we it was already mentioned yesterday. And Lerner took issue with this influential book for its androcentric focus. She pointed out that the main characteristics of the techniques of enslavement, which Patterson outlined in his book, were initially developed and perfected upon female war captives. Patterson eventually accepted some of Lerner's critique. In his later book, Freedom in the Making of Western Culture, which came out in 1991, he drew on Lerner's insights and declared that the Greek and Roman notions of civic rights in antiquity were, in fact, rooted in the earlier experience of women's slavery, so that deprivation of rights. Lerner herself insisted that women were not only the archetypical slaves, but were, in fact, the first slaves. This famous contention was soon taken up by feminist theorists, notably by Carol Peterman in her influential 1988 book, The Sexual Contract. As far as historians were concerned, some studies later confirmed that women were indeed the preferred slaves, to use her term, in many pre-industrial societies, and that they probably constituted the majority of the enslaved in Africa. In 2009, Martin Klein, a renowned historian of human bondage in Africa, affirmed that Lerner was right in assuming, and I quote, "The origin of slavery was probably the question of what to do with captives," end of quote, and that whereas men in prehistoric and ancient times were traditionally killed in violent conflicts, women were captured and brought into a host society. Nonetheless, Klein emphasized that, in most cases, female captives in Africa were incorporated into the slaving societies as wives, an observation that insinuated a less abusive form of enslavement and sexual exploitation than the one depicted by Lerner. The first choice went to the chiefs of the winning tribes or to the war leaders, as well as to priests. This, according to Klein, allowed the members of the male elite to have more offspring, which was an advantage at an early stage of social evolution. Going back now to Lerner's argument in her essay on women and slavery. So according to Patterson's original argument in Slavery and Social Death, and I quote, slaves were always persons who had been dishonored in a generalized way, end of quote. Lerner, however, called attention to the gendered implications of the generalized dishonor of slaves. She delineated the oppositional construction of honor in societies in which free women were considered the bearers of male honor, and the dishonorable status of female slaves implied their inherent vulnerability to rape. Inspired by Lerner's insights, some feminist scholars later suggested modifications of this overarching argument, proposing that in certain pre-modern societies, the notion of male and female honor and dishonor were actually incompatible with the capture and raping of women. For instance, Russian scholar Mariana Muravyeva recently suggested that in pre-modern Russia, such practices were actually associated with presumably savage regions that Russia sought to conquer and were thus largely discouraged in Russia proper, even though Russia was undoubtedly a slaveholding patriarchal society. According to Lerner, classical writers such as Homer describe men traditionally being killed during armed conflicts because of the perceived danger they posed for their enemies, while their women were enslaved, raped, and brought into the conqueror's societies. This degradation of foreign women who were forcibly incorporated into the slaving societies as concubines and prostitutes had a further negative influence on local women, who were now regarded as inferior because they resembled the downcast and subordinated slaves. Subsequent feminist studies of Greco-Roman culture have further elucidated how plays such as Euripides' tragedy, The Trojan Women, authored in the 5th century before the Common Era, bear out Gerda Lerner's point that for women, sexual exploitation marked the very definition of enslavement. And this was a quote from this book. Needless to say, the problem of women's rape under captivity did not end with classical antiquity. In her seminal study, Lerner affirmed that women's exploitation, I quote, exploitation as concubines and war spoils continues from the time of the Homeric epic into the modern period, end of quote. Since this study's first publication in 1983, localized historical studies have lent ample support for this hypothesis. Indeed, we now know that enslaved women often outnumbered male slaves in historical societies, and that most enslaved people in the contemporary world are women and girls. Moreover, scholars of slavery now also characterize sexual exploitation as a distinguishing feature of female slavery throughout the centuries and across the globe. Methodologically, Lerner exposed the erasure of women's enslavement due to the employment of linguistic terms that elide not only the gender specificity of the female slavery experience, but also the very presence of enslaved women in different slaving societies. Historical records often use generic terms, such as slaves, in a masculine plural form that was used to designate both males and females, and that modern historians then interpret, still today, as referring only or primarily to men. Tellingly, More than 25 years after the publication of Lerner's original essay, enslaved females remained nearly invisible in much of the historiographic discourse on slavery. Slavery and Abolition, again, the journal that published her pioneering article in 1983, continued to focus almost exclusively on enslaved men well into the 21st century, with less than 10% of its articles being devoted to enslaved women. While this has improved for Atlantic slavery in the last 2 decades, it continues to be the case for female slavery in early modern Europe. Nonetheless, Lerner's important observations have motivated some feminist scholars, such as feminist Spanish historian Aurelia Martín Casares, to undertake studies of women's enslavement. In 2002, Martín Casares, who uncovered the preponderance of enslaved women in 16th century Granada, lamented the persistence of the androcentric tendencies first noted by Lerner in 21st century studies of early modern slavery in Spain. As the work of my FemSMed ERC project and our team, who I hope are online and can see and hear us, as our work continues to reveal, that paradigmatic consensus which construes human bondage in the early modern Mediterranean as essentially male still continues to distort historians' understanding of the motivations, implications, and main traits of female enslavement. As our ongoing research shows, however, female enslavement continued to exist not only in Spain, but also in the territories of present-day Italy, Malta, and France throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, and you will hear more about it in a few minutes from Einav. Lerner's thesis on the interplay of patriarchy and slavery, it should be noted, was actually challenged by prominent historians of slavery. In his influential 2006 book, Inhuman Bondage, The Rise and Fall of Slavery in the New World, David Bryan Davis, a leading American historian of slavery, considered that foreign women were forcibly exploited for providing sexual services, as well as performing heavy labor in some ancient patriarchal societies. However, he argued that this was not the case in ancient Mesopotamia, where by the second millennium before the Common Era, slaving society already absorbed large numbers of male captives as publicly owned slaves. It was in ancient Sumer, Davis contends in his famous book, that the domestication of animals came to shape the evolving institution of slavery. In particular, he charted the practices of branding and naming both male and female slaves in Mesopotamia as if they were domestic animals, and that of pricing enslaved individuals according to their equivalent in chickens, pigs, cows, and horses. 2 years after the publication of Inhuman Bondage, Joseph Miller, a noted scholar of African history and of the Atlantic slave trade, issued a harsher critique of Lerner's thesis on patriarchy and slavery. In his 2008 essay, Miller unkindly characterizes Lerner's linking of women's abduction for marital and raping purposes as, I quote, a loosely associational argument, basically noting the parallel degrees of male power and control attributed to both slavery and patriarchy, and documented mostly ancient Mediterranean body counts calculated in terms of the numbers of women and children captured, end of quote. According to Miller, Lerner does not try to chart, again I quote, coherent historical sequence from raping to slaving, or to establish the causation that she implies. It was, Miller maintains, only Orlando Patterson who, in his 1999 Freedom in the Making of Western Culture, finally took, I quote, Lerner's point, a step in this direction in his meticulous account, end of quote. Luckily for us, then, Patterson ultimately read the canonical Greek and Roman texts of antiquity to ascribe the origins of the concept of individual freedom beyond Lerner's pragmatics to the captive women enslaved at the dawn of Western civilization. Miller explicitly, and as you can understand, to my mind, unconvincingly, sets out to reverse the position that Lerner advocated, which situated the human drive to enslave in the origins of patriarchy. Instead, he posited domestic purposes as the primary motivation for enslaving women. The capturing and enslavement of women, Miller exclaims, derived primarily from women's utility for the slaving society, that is, from their fertility and reproductive capacities. This is an echo of Klein's argument, and not from the habits of mind formed out of male warriors' desire to abuse or oppress foreign women whose male kin they had defeated in war. In context in which this was not the primary motivation for slaving, as in modern North America, slaving practices elevated male labor. Contrary to Lerner, Miller concluded, and I quote for the last time, one need not invoke the much more occasional circumstances of war, rape, and seizure of defeated enemies' women, end of quote, to account for the recurrent and global enslavement of women throughout history. Not all feminist historians, however, agree. In more recent years, Americanists have challenged the persistence of historical narratives that downplay or erase the significance of sexual violence as a motivation for slavery. With the advent of the age of Black Lives Matter, American historians have emphasized the problematic relationships among sexual violence, reproductive exploitation, and economics. In a 2022 interview, Tavolia Glimpf, author of Out of the House of Bondage, The Transformation of the Plantation Household, and former president of the American Historical Association in 2024, acknowledged the tremendous impact of Lerner's work on her own thinking on slavery and gender, and she emphasized the enduring relevance of Lerner's foundational studies for our own thinking about women's enslavement today. And I'd now like to let Einav continue and tell us more about the relevance of Lerner's insight. So thank you for listening.